This is the Nebraska Broadcasters Association History Project. Look at the people and the personalities who have made Nebraska radio and television what it is today. We're recording today at WOWT-TV, Channel 6 in Omaha. Our thanks to Jeff Sabin for his help. For the NBA, I'm Neil Nelkin. Our guest today, best described as a broadcast entrepreneur. Done it all, seen it all, and made most of it happen. We welcome to the Nebraska Broadcasters Association History Project, David Kelly. David, nice to see you.
Nice to see you, Neil. Good to be here. Thank you for inviting.
First, I want to compliment you on your choice of shirt.
It's the official NBA, Nebraska Broadcasters Association logo, and it's something that we did. I was on the board of directors for a couple of years, and one of those years we had shirts that some of the directors still wear, I believe. But this was an opportunity to haul it out of the closet and show it off one last time.
We're glad you did. You have been involved in so many areas in Nebraska broadcasting, and even early in your career in other parts of the country. Can you take us back where it all began and how you became a broadcaster?
For that, I've got to go back to Detroit, Michigan, which is where I was born. We were right in the core of the city for most of that time that I was growing up. My mother was a bookkeeper back when she was working. She became a full-time mom after I was born. And my dad was a commercial artist in Detroit, mostly show card art and sales chart art for the automotive industry. So I learned a little bit about the ad agency business during the time I was growing up. But my interest in broadcasting, I think, began at a very early age. I listened to a lot of early radio at home. We were not the first on the block to have television. So I was back in the Green Hornet, Lone Ranger days on the radio.
And which originated in Detroit.
Yes, it did. And that was my first fascination with it. And then television came along and I kind of drifted away from it a little bit. We wound up moving into a Detroit suburb when I was going into my 8th grade of school, and moved to a suburb called Allen Park. In 1960, wound up graduating from Allen Park High School, and actually took my first broadcasting job the day after graduation. But my interest in broadcasting had actually rekindled during my high school years. Like a lot of kids that got involved in broadcasting during the time that I got involved in it, I set up a small mock radio station in my basement, complete with turntables and microphone and tape recorder and whatever. Of course, it was only on a PA system. I was too scared to buy a little 10-watt transmitter and try that game that a lot of them play. But that got me basically practicing. You know, you'd do record programs and remote broadcasts and whatever. And I had some other school friends that I brought into it. I also started doing record dances when I was in school, not only in my own school, but also jobbing it out. Would go on Saturdays to what they called the One Stop, which is where the jukebox people bought their 45 RPM records. And they let me buy the latest records there for, I don't know, 35 cents a piece or whatever the cost was at that point. And you know, off to the dance I would be on a Friday or on a Saturday night. And I also became an entrepreneur when I was in high school, recording our school choir and our band on my tape recorder, which happened to be an Ampex 601.
Pretty high tech for those days.
Pretty high tech and pretty fancy for those days. And then pressed records and sold them for the band and for the choir to raise money. And I made a few bucks on it also. Produced an album and also a 45 RPM record that had the fight song on one side and the alma mater on the other.
So radio and dollars, income, started with you pretty early.
It really did. I started out, my first job was in Mount Clemens, Michigan, working for Milt Maltz. Malwright may be a name that you remember from your earlier
Absolutely.
broadcasting days, but he and his partner Bob Wright owned two radio stations, one down in Ohio that Bob was at, and Milt had the one in Mount Clemens, Michigan. They were located in the basement of a hotel in downtown Mount Clemens. Mount Clemens was famous for their mineral baths. And so as soon as you walked into the radio station or into the hallway, it became apparent that, that the odor was coming from the mineral baths, and it was something that was quite frankly hard to get used to. But I worked there for the better part of a summer, and then prior to taking on my college endeavors at Wayne State University in Detroit, wound up getting not one but two different radio jobs. One was a sign-on at a fine arts station, WQRS in Detroit, and then I worked some weekend shifts at another classical music station, WABX, that was in downtown Detroit. I knew nothing about classical music, so my learning curve got pretty steep for me. But essentially, I did it enough to interrupt my school to a point where I was spending more time at the radio station than I was at college classes. And also enough to know that I did not want to continue in talent, that I wanted to get involved in ownership. And that led to my first encounter getting involved in Detroit broadcasting.
So you actually built an FM station in Detroit.
Yes, here's the story on this. The summer out of my first year in college, a friend of mine that I'd met in college who was an engineer, and another buddy of mine that went on to become one of my announcers at the station, and he later built a broadcasting production company in Detroit and was a freelance talent. We set out in my dad's station wagon, went to Washington, D.C. to look at the FCC database cards in order to see if there was any unbuilt construction permit in the Detroit area, or anywhere in Michigan for that matter.
You were pretty savvy at that
Well,
point.
savvy enough to know that I didn't have enough money to spend on an FCC attorney to do the research for me. And it was a good opportunity, I guess, for a road trip. But that was back in the days when you could actually walk into the FCC and tell them what you needed, and they'd say, well, it's in that file over there. You know, we could actually look at their card file. And the interesting thing that came out of that is we were able to write down the information off the card for the owners of a station that was not built yet, a construction permit, at 92.3 on the dial. And I got the contact information. It was a guy by the name of Sleepy Stein.
That was his name.
That was his name. It was also his on-air, I think it was more on-air name. I don't know what his real legitimate name was, but Sleepy Stein lived in California in the LA area, and he and a couple of investors had this construction permit. So when I got back home, I called Sleepy Stein, and he was a jazz disc jockey on some obscure LA area FM station. And I said, do you want to sell your construction permit? Now, mind you, at that point, I'm 19 years old. He doesn't know whether he's talking to somebody that's 35 or 55, you know.
Or flush with money or indigent.
Exactly. And he said, well, let me check with Hank, my partner, and see, I'll get back with you. So I didn't hear from him for a week or so. I called him back and I said, wondering if he had a chance to meet with your partner. He says, yeah. He says, we talked it over, and Hank says, yeah, I think I'd like to, we should sell. And I said, okay, and what are the terms? He said, well, we need $10,000, but that includes the equipment, includes the transmitter and the antenna. I thought, well, okay. I did not have $10,000 at that point. I had about $500 that I'd put together in savings working for my dad's art studio during the summers. But I said, okay, well, we'll get back with you. I later find out that Hank, his partner, is Henry Mancini. The Henry Mancini.
Hank.
Okay, Hank, yes. So then I was faced with, okay, now what do we do? And what I did is I formed a corporation, and just like you sell insurance, found every relative, friend, anybody I could shake hands with, and sold stock in the corporation, put enough money together to buy the construction permit, plus the operating money and other equipment needs and whatever. And that was the beginning of WLIN. The station is still on the air, not with those call signs. They're owned by iHeart right now.
Isn't everything?
Yes. That's another story. We'll
Yeah.
talk about that.
So when you put the station on the air, what experience had you had or any of your associates had?
None. And
And a market like Detroit is pretty competitive.
Well, it is. We put it on the air as a suburban FM station. And if I had to rethink that, that was a bad idea. But I wanted to be able to do all the local things in a local community. I guess I wanted it manageable. And it was fully staffed. We had a news director, a sports director, a salesman, a couple salespeople, a lot of on-air talent. But we quickly ran out of money. And the second year in operation, we'd figured out, or I had figured out, what we needed to do to be able to make the thing survive, but it wasn't enough to pay back the back bills and whatever. We moved into downtown Detroit. We traded some space. We began to program full-time jazz instead of the MOR format that we were doing. Picked up some listenership. We actually wound up in an Arbitron, and the three of the Detroit area stations wound up sending representatives to Beltsville to look at the diaries, because an FM station had never wound up in an Arbitron up till that point.
Beltsville, Maryland, the headquarters of Arbitron.
Exactly. And the SEP penetration, FM SEP penetration in Detroit at that time was 7%. The only way you had FM in a car was buying one of these Blaupunkt converters that ran it through an AM radio, converted FM back to AM. So anyway, the second year was better. We had a handle on our expenses, but not enough to really make it successful. And we were approached by Hy Levinson, the owner of WCAR AM in Detroit, wanting to buy a radio station. And at that time, I didn't really want to sell, but I had sold off my controlling interest in order to put cash in. And so we went to the shareholders, and the shareholders wanted to sell even though they were only going to get 5% of their money back. And so the rest is history. The station was sold to, in '64, to Hy Levinson at WCAR, and became WCAR FM.
Just as FM was becoming dominant in the industry.
Yes.
So then you move on to Michigan and Wisconsin, a few other places where you also built radio stations.
During the time that I was in Detroit, I announced to my staff that we were selling, that we were going to be selling, and that I was going to be leaving, and they were going to have to find other work. I had a part-time employee worked for me on weekends by the name of Ed Selleck. And Ed was in the landscaping business. He had gone to one of the broadcasting schools in the Detroit area and wanted in the worst way to get out of landscaping and into broadcasting. And he actually had some on-air talent. He was a pretty good sounding guy. And we were talking one Sunday morning during his shift. He said, "What are you going to do?" And I said, "I have no idea." I said, "I'd like to stay in the business. I'd like to build another radio station somewhere." He says, "Well, you should look at the Upper Peninsula of Michigan in Manistee." And Manistee is a little town on the top side of Lake Michigan.
Had you heard of it?
I had heard of it, but I'd never been there. My parents and I vacationed in the UP, but just barely over the bridge. And Back when we were vacationing, in fact, there was no bridge. You had to take the ferry to get between the upper and lower peninsula. Anyway, Ed and I drove up there because his sister had a cottage on a lake near Manistee. And he said, I want you to look at this town. So a town of 5,000 people with no radio station. And he and I decided to partner up, and we built WTIQ in Manistee, put it on the air in 1965.
AM radio station.
AM, 1490, 1,000-watt day, 250 nighttime, and non-directional.
Class 4, or what was Class 4 at the time.
Yes, exactly. Yep,
Yeah.
Class 4.
And how'd that go for you?
It was rocky. Ed was in his 50s. I was in my 20s. We did not see eye to eye on a lot of things. We had some turbulent times. It's where I learned how to sell, not because I was so good, but because I needed money. And when you're desperate, you do desperate things, like write ads and take spec tapes down to clients and that kind of stuff.
Survival.
And it was survival time. But Ed and I had a falling out. I wound up leaving for almost a year and went to work for Post Corporation over in Eau Claire, Wisconsin, running their radio stations over there and also doing some television news and weather. And finally, after billings had dropped off to a point where Ed was not surviving, I came back and wound up buying him out. And I was there until early 1972. And billing improved when I came back. In fact, went right through the roof. They have yet to bill in Manistee, Michigan, what I billed during those years.
We hear that story frequently from entrepreneurs in this business. And you move on to Green Bay.
Green Bay was a stop that I made after I sold the Manistee station. I knew Jim Zimmerman, who was the general manager at WNFL in Green Bay. And so I just stopped in for a visit. Just to say hi, you know, and had a couple of cocktails, and cocktails led to dinner, and dinner led to more cocktails. And when I came home, I announced to my wife that I'd taken a job as sales manager at WNFL in Green Bay. We were already in the Green Bay area, or moving down to the Green Bay area. So I was there, and then spent about a year there. And then I took a job with a congressman, Harold Freilich. I was one of his district congressional representatives. Did that for about a year and also helped run his election campaign. And then during that time went to work for an ad agency, built a recording studio, brokered, this is over about a 6-year period, brokered radio and TV stations for Chapman Associates, and then wound up going to work for McMartin Industries, selling consoles and transmitters.
Famous Omaha-based Ray McMartin.
Yes, I
and,
knew.
That got you introduced to a lot of people around the Omaha area.
It did. I still, you know, in the Omaha engineering community, and I was down here, they would bring us in for sales meetings. A lot of the people that are involved in engineering, or have been involved in engineering over the years in Omaha, were actually employees, engineers at McMartin Industries. Including Charlie Goodrich, that is a name that's well known, and some of the other technicians.
Well, we've interviewed Jim
Yes.
Leadham, and he's talked about
Yes,
McMartin as well.
Exactly. So that led me to actually taking a job as a national sales and marketing manager at UMC Bocart in Connecticut.
That's B-E-A-U-C-A-R-T.
Right. They had invented the Bow motor, which was a low-profile motor using cart tape equipment. And they decided to build their own cart tape machines in competition with ITC. And I was there for a little over a year. Interesting experience, but they had a change in management, and it became apparent that I did not have a future under the new management, so I went out looking for work and wound up at Harris Corporation and took on a territory based out of Sioux Falls, South Dakota, which I currently live in. covering the Dakotas, Minnesota, Iowa, and Nebraska.
Then the next big event in your career, Gregory, South Dakota.
Gregory, South Dakota.
How big a town is Gregory?
I don't know, 800 people, maybe 1,000, I don't know. Pretty tiny. But I was calling on a client there that had a construction permit for a new FM. Went out to visit with him, sold him some equipment. And during the course of that conversation, he said, "You know of somebody that would like to run the radio station?" I mean, like a manager? And he said, no. He said, we would basically give him the radio station, and then he could take whatever profit he wanted, and we don't want any money, we just want to get it on the air. I said, "I believe you're talking to him." So that put me into Gregory. The problem, and we were immensely successful. I wound up building it, putting it on the air. We were the first in the region to have a country music station on FM. We sold spots like crazy. I mean, it was just, it was wildly successful. Basically, what I had been able to do is take all the things that I'd learned over the years and build a solid broadcasting sales department, make it work.
Now, in Gregory, South Dakota, how many salespeople?
I had actually 4 salespeople. We were selling into northern Nebraska. We were selling into the Ainsworth, O'Neill area. And we were selling, we covered about 70-mile radius, so we were selling everywhere in that area, up to Chamberlain, over to Winter, over to Lake Andes to the east. Pretty good size area that we covered.
So your reps were on the road a lot.
We were doing really well, except that the guy that I had bought the construction permit from decided that he was going to back out on the deal because we were so successful. He wanted a bigger share than we had originally agreed to, and at that point I left, and that led me into West Point, Nebraska. So that was the transition.
Now you're a Nebraska broadcaster. How did West Point come about?
Looked at 13 different towns in 3 states. Evaluated them, and West Point kept coming up to the top of the pile. The problem was finding a frequency that would work. There had been a number of attempts prior to that to put an FM station in there, and they couldn't do the engineering. In fact, they couldn't do the engineering on the AM side either, except that my consulting engineer was able to find a frequency at the same time that the FCC was putting daytime stations on on clear channel stations.
Daytimers on the clear channel.
Daytimers
the
on
big
the clears.
stations.
And so basically in a very short period of time, he said, we can file it. We filed it as a 1,000-watt station. We had somebody that jumped our frequency down in Kansas and forced us into 500 watts, so we compromised. We were able to build. The Kansas station never got built. And there's another story there, too, that presented an opportunity for us later on.
This is on 840.
This is on 840, the clear that WHAS Louisville is on. We put that on the air in 1985 as KWPN.
West Point, Nebraska.
West Point, Nebraska. And the rest is history, I guess.
Daytime AM station. Covered a large area for the daytime signal.
It's a big signal. Even at 500 watts, it was a big signal. Covered essentially primary service for 13 different communities. It was before the current and immediate deterioration of small towns as we know it in not just Nebraska, but all over the country. But we were very successful. We had a moment of panic when the FCC decided to drop a frequency in FM into West Point. They were doing assignments at that time before the auction process. And they decided to do frequencies in various small towns, and so we went ahead right away and applied, and nobody else jumped on it. I think primarily because we already had the AM station. They were concerned about being the lone FM competitor.
At that time,
yes.
FM was not quite so dominant.
Right. And so we were able to get a Class A FM, and then at about that same time, I was monitoring the situation down in Lyons, Kansas, where they had the same frequency at 250 watts non-built. So I called down there to find out if they were going to build it or not, and they said, no, actually, we're having some issues. And I said, would you be interested in turning in your license to the FCC? My FCC attorney said, well, nobody's ever done that before. The commission doesn't know how to handle that. So we paid him $10,000, and he turned in his license, and then turned around and refiled for 5,000 watts non-directional, which we got. And that's where they're at today. It's now KTIC, but that's how we wound up with the higher power on the AM. And then later down the line, we simply did an increase to a C2 on the FM and put it on the same tower as a 300-foot tower. And we couldn't move it physically down toward Omaha or anywhere to the east. I didn't want to move it to the west. So we just put 50 kilowatts on our 300-foot, and there was the AM and FM in West Point.
And that gives you a full-time signal.
It gave us a full-time signal, yes.
Which opens up a lot of opportunities.
It does, mostly sports. We were very, very heavy in sports. I had a great sports director. We did a lot of games, and we did everything, you know, volleyball, football, basketball. If it was a sport, it was on the air.
And sold.
And sold, oh yeah, absolutely.
The most important part.
Yeah.
You moved on from West Point?
We had, over the years, developed kind of a relationship with the folks at Nebraska Rural Radio.
KRVN.
KRVN. Eric Brown's wife's mother lived in West Point, and they visited there often. And it became apparent that they wanted to develop some kind of a relationship, an LMA, for us to take programming. We explored a number of opportunities, and finally, one day we were able to come to an agreement, and we wound up selling the stations to Nebraska Rural Radio. They were looking for a big AM signal to cover that part of the state. For me, I didn't really want to sell at that point in time, but it was time to move on. So I was burned out. I was doing everything. I was signing on, selling ads, writing copy, covering news.
How old were you at this point?
At this point, I'm in my early 40s.
So you're still young.
I'm still a young guy, yeah. But I had been doing that form of broadcasting for a number of years, and I think it was wearing me out. It was time to stop.
So you sell West Point to Nebraska Rural Radio, and now you can kind of sit back and take it easy.
I can, except I'm studying on a construction permit for a new FM in Albion, Nebraska.
Now, Albion is, let's place that for people that aren't familiar, kind of south and west of Norfolk?
Yes, and it's directly west of West Point by, I don't know, 50, 60 miles.
And if you think West Point is a small town, Albion is a really small town.
It is smaller, yes, it is. And I didn't know quite what I wanted to do with it. The history on the Albion station is that shortly after we were on the air in West Point, in our very first studio location, AM only, a gentleman walks in the door by the name of Willie Scala. And Willie is a food rep that calls on grocery stores. And he's all excited. He said, I want to build a station in Albion. And I figured, well, Albion's 60, 70 miles away. I don't care, you know, no competition for me. But he says, you guys are doing such a great job. He said, I want to duplicate everything you're doing. I spent the day with him. When he walked out, he had our music lists. He had our logs. He had notes on who to hire, how much to pay, how to set up a sales operation, the whole ball of wax. And sure enough, about a year later, he puts this station on the air. It didn't sound like the station that he had planned. He had sold his interest in it because he didn't really have enough money to build it to another broadcaster in the state. And the community was not exactly receptive to what was being programmed. My wife and I, Sharon, drove over to the Albion area one of the first nights after we learned they were on the air. And I actually met Willie over there. He happened to be there just by chance. So I got a tour of the radio station. Nice facility, beautiful little station. But the programming was just horrible and the community hated it. So I came back to West Point thinking that, well, that's probably not going to work. Let's kind of monitor that. The long and short of it is that they went dark. They had some financial issues. They weren't able to sustain it. And so I kind of kept my eye on it. And eventually the FCC released the license again assigned to that city. And I filed on the assignment and got the construction permit, and then turned around and increased the power level to a C2. And so when I sold West Point, I'm sitting on this construction permit for a 50,000 watt FM in Albion, Nebraska, where they didn't want a radio station. So I'm living out at Cottonwood Chimes Lake near West Point, not doing much, having sold the station, relaxing, unwinding, and I get a knock on the door from this young 24-year-old kid that's all excited about radio and wants to know if I'd be interested in selling my construction permit.
In Albion?
In Albion. And the young man's name is Mike Flood, and his interest is in building a new radio station in Norfolk. And he thinks that maybe we could find a tower location that would fit that particular situation.
No, he had no other stations at this point.
No, he was fresh out of school at
And
that
had
point.
worked part-time at KLIN, and that was the sum total of his broadcast experience.
He had some experience, I believe, down in South Bend when he was going to school.
At Notre Dame.
Yes, at Notre Dame. But he was familiar with the Norfolk area. He was excited. He wanted to know news and provide information to the community, and convinced me that I should sell him my construction permit, which I did. And then that was really the beginning of a long friendship, and that's continued to this day. I provided a lot of assistance for him in setting up his studios and helping him with his transmitter setup, helped him buy his McMartin transmitter used
Which you knew
from
well.
Charlie Goodrich, good product, and helped him get the thing on the air.
He went on to become a state senator from Norfolk.
He did.
He became Speaker of the legislature, ran for governor, and has built what may be the most extensive statewide radio and television network facility in the country.
I'm very proud of Mike. He's a dynamic guy. I know him not just as a broadcast associate, but as a friend. And it couldn't happen to a nicer guy. He's got a lot of energy, a lot of ideas. He's a good positive force in the Nebraska broadcasting community, and I hope he's able to sustain that.
So now, once again, you have sold the Albion station, and time to put your feet up and relax and take advantage of all you've earned.
I did. We decided to move up to Sioux Falls. We had been there for a while when I was with Harris. Moved down to West Point to build the station, and now back to Sioux Falls. I had gotten involved. One of the things that some people don't know about me is my other parallel career. I had gotten involved back when I was in Green Bay as a volunteer emergency medical technician, basically an EMT volunteer, trying to help people that were in physical trouble. And that continued back when I was in West Point. I volunteered with them. And during the time that I owned and operated the West Point stations, I had some time on my hands, so I went to Creighton University and got certified as a paramedic. I had already become an instructor for the Nebraska Department of Health as an EMS instructor. And so now I was a paramedic instructor in addition to working part-time as a paramedic down in Fremont when I was in Nebraska. During the time that I was still at the West Point stations, I wound up training several years worth of Norfolk firefighters, their first paramedics. They now have a full paramedic service up there on their fire department. When I moved to Sioux Falls, I thought, well, I'll maybe get a part-time job in Sioux Falls, see what I can do there. Well, they hired me full-time, and I wound up spending 5 years at Rural Metro Ambulance, working the streets as a paramedic, and also as their training coordinator on the service. Flew on the helicopter, flew on fixed wing, put together their CAS certification program. And then it occurred to me that I was an old man doing a young man's job and that it was time to hang it up. So I did, but basically I was involved for 30 years on and off in emergency medical service, in addition to the things that I've done in broadcasting.
Now, is this about the time you decided to get into the food service industry?
I did. I've been fascinated with fast food for years, not just eating it. Obviously, I've had my share of dining there. But I was fascinated with the business, wondering if there was a way to get into it without spending an arm and a leg. And the answer to that is no, there isn't. But I got involved in Subway, actually bought a franchise, built a new store, and the day we opened the new store, made a deal to buy a second store. So I wound up from 2004 until 2013 as a Subway franchisee and entrepreneur.
Why'd you get out of that?
The Subway is probably one of the best food franchises out there. The personnel challenges, hiring good people is unreal. And I have a great deal of compassion for anybody in fast food. I know what they go through on a daily basis. It's very, very challenging. It was a good experience. I loved it, but I'm glad I'm out of it.
Out of it and back into broadcasting?
Well, yes.
From the frying pan into the fire.
Back into the fire. I was approached by Mike Flood, who was in the process of buying KNEN, one of his competitors in Norfolk, about buying KTCH in Wayne, Nebraska.
This is an AM station in Wayne.
AM station, actually AM FM.
Okay.
And I had tried to buy the stations back when I was in West Point. And couldn't get the owner then to even talk to me. Well, about the same time that I sold West Point, he sold Wayne to Gene Kane at KNEN. So basically the Wayne radio stations were part of the KNEN package and kind of went with the package when Mike bought KNEN. So Mike, over a period of long period of many months, worked on me and eventually convinced me that it would be a great idea for me to own the Wayne radio stations. So in 2008, that happened, and I'm actually glad it did. I was resistive to getting back in the business, but I'm so extremely thankful now that I did, because it's turned out to be good for me. It's given me purpose, excitement. It allowed me to continue to contribute in the broadcasting business in Nebraska, and the rest is history, I guess.
So now you've got an AM FM in a small town of Wayne, Nebraska. There's a college there.
Yes.
But not a lot else.
It's a very vital community, and I was surprised because Wayne had grown during the time that I was in West Point. I didn't spend a lot of time in Wayne, but I was amazed when I went back to examine it, when Mike and I were talking in in late 2007 to see what was going on in Wayne, a very vital community. The college certainly helps. Having Wayne State College in the community is a good partner for the community, but there's a lot of industry there. There's Great Dane Trailer, there's Heritage Homes, and some other very vital and thriving small industries. Our big problem right now in Wayne is housing. We don't have enough housing to be able to bring people in to work all the jobs that are there. There are a lot of people that drive great distance every day to come to Wayne to work the jobs that are involved there. But that's been an interesting experience, primarily from the standpoint of it's different than what I had done before, because in previous radio stations that I had built, I had been very involved in the day-to-day operation. I mean, where I did everything, signed on, sold, covered news, whatever. This is different because now I'm just managing, and I'm doing it not only that, remotely. I'm not in Wayne all the time. That's challenging, but it's also doable now because of the internet, because of the amount of things that we can do online. And the fact that I can monitor the stations online, I can hear them on my phone and on my computer. We meet online, we do bill paying online, we have punch in and punch out online. Everything is internet based. So whether I'm in Sioux Falls or if I'm in California or on vacation in Michigan or wherever, I've pretty much got the same level of contact. I like being there, but at the same time, me not being there also forces my staff, my incredible staff, to live up to their potential. I've got a great crew. I've worked with some really great broadcasters over the years, and the crew of people that I have right now in Wayne is just exceptional. These are really talented, wonderful people that really understand the business and know what they're doing.
As a small market broadcaster in Wayne, Nebraska, AM/FM, how do you break out your staff? How many people on staff, and what are the responsibilities?
I have one office manager that does logs, takes care of the routine billing, getting the deposits made, picking up the mail, answering phone, doing those kinds of things. I have a full-time salesperson in Wayne. I have another telemarketing and street service person that's located in Norfolk. I have a full-time program director who's on air and manages programming, and then a combination news and sports person. We supplement that with some part-time sports people and some part-time board op people. But that's the whole crew, that's the whole staff.
You've got good people that you can depend on to get done
Yes.
what needs to be done.
Yes, they're exceptional, they're multi-talented. They like what they're doing. I think they love what they're doing. They're dedicated to the community, and they understand our mission, which is basically keeping the community informed 24/7 of what's happening around them, news, sports, weather, and all the other stuff that goes along with it.
And in that part of the country, weather is critical.
It is. We've had 2 tornadoes hit Wayne during the time that I've owned the radio station. Fortunately, not hitting the radio station, but yeah, weather is a big factor.
Your Wayne stations, how large an area do they cover, and how large an area do you sell?
The coverage is approximately 35 miles, which is about typical for a small town radio station. We're selling a little bit into the Norfolk area, a little bit into Sioux City, trying to keep it in areas that don't compete with local retailers. Local sales are obviously, within that 30-mile umbrella. We cover Wakefield, we cover Laurel, Randolph. We have a lot of listeners in some of the other communities, smaller towns around there, but Wayne is our primary focus.
You have been successful as a small market broadcaster It's an area that a lot of people just can't seem to figure out. You've got it figured out. What's the difference?
First of all, you've got to think out of the box. You cannot use the rules that you were using even 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. You can't do it like you used to. The other thing that is changing our industry, and this is the big challenge for not just small market, but all markets, not just in Nebraska, but nationwide, is the integration of the new digital products into what we're doing. One of the very first things I did in 2008 when I went into Wayne was we redeveloped the website. It was ktch.com. We rebranded it as WayneDailyNews.com. And instead of making it a format-based website, it is a news and information-based website. All of the streaming that we do on sports is based out of there. 5 years ago, I walked in after an NAB convention with a video camera and announced to the staff that we were going to be recording our news stories on video, and they didn't want any part of that. I've never seen people react that way. It was like, no, we're not doing that. Now, if I told them we were going to take the camera away, they would say, no, you can't do that. We have some people that are doing some great editing work and doing some great video work. I think the integration of video into what you're doing in the radio station is an important part of our future. We post our video news stories now, not just on our website online, but we also post them on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and if another medium comes along, we'll be doing that also.
Are you able to aggressively sell your online and video content?
We do. We do pre-roll sell, not as much as I would like, but I mean we are. We do have content active on the website. The website's got good numbers. I mean, and those are measurable. You can take those numbers out to a client, and it's virtual guarantee that X number of people are going. Now it varies with the time of the year and the kinds of stories you have up and whatever, but you've got to have a digital component, and you can't do it like you used to do it back in the good old days.
We remember them, and we remember them fondly, but it's a memory.
It is.
It's not current broadcasting.
No.
Over the years, you've seen a lot of things, you've done a lot of things. And David, what would be your most memorable experience in the business that you've come to be a part of and to love?
Oh, to single one out, I think would probably, excuse me, be doing my career disservice. I have been so blessed to be able to be in this business, and I am grateful every day for the opportunities that it is presented. There's a magic that happens with bringing a community a small market radio station, and I've had that opportunity up in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. I had it for a short while over in Gregory, certainly had it in West Point. The Wayne radio station is different in that in my previous experiences I had an opportunity to build those stations and to hire people to do it the way I wanted to do it. I inherited basically the entire staff and that facility in Wayne when I bought that station. And so the first couple of months when I'm taking ideas into them and being sufficiently ignored, it occurred to me that I wasn't going to move these people, that I needed, if I was going to change things, it had to happen from a different perspective. And so I took that into account. We move now at a slower pace, but we have in fact been able to change the mold a little bit. But to single out one particular experience, I just the experience of bringing broadcasting to a community that hasn't had any is just it's rewarding in itself. And Mike Flood can attest to that. He's had the opportunity to do that over in Norfolk too.
Has done the same thing to some degree
Yes.
that you've been able to do. Over the years, any missed opportunities you wish you could have another shot at?
Sure. There's always that station in that market that you should have built but didn't move on it fast enough. And so, do you have regrets? I've thought about, should I have built what Mike wound up building? But I don't think that I would have built it like Mike did, and it may not have been the same product or as dynamic or as successful as he did. I had my shot at those opportunities when I did Detroit, certainly when I did the one on the Upper Peninsula, certainly West Point. My situation now in Wayne is a little bit different in that I'm honored to be the caretaker of that facility for the last 13 years. Hopefully I will do the community justice in doing a good enough job of providing them with a basic broadcast service that they've become accustomed to and that they need. So it's a little different approach than bringing a brand new service, but again, providing them with new services under that same umbrella is probably just as thrilling as putting a new station on the air.
One of the best parts about this business that we're in is we get to work with young people. Two things. One, it keeps us young.
It does.
And two, we get to mentor.
Yes.
And you've seen people that you've started young and have gone on to successful careers. And what is so important about that to you?
It's an extension of me, I think. And it started very, very early in Detroit. I had a handful of people that went on to become very, very successful in the business. A young black undertaker's son by the name of Don Haney worked for me. I hired him away from another station when we put the Detroit FM on the air and began to play jazz. Don went on to a big broadcasting career, including television at the ABC O&O in Detroit. Ron Rose Productions, again, was in my Boy Scout troop and was one of the people that traveled with me to look at the card catalog at the FCC, and many others. When I built the station up in Manistee, my first announcer was Gene Kaufman. Gene is now down in Florida, retired, but he went on to build several other radio stations, became very, very successful in the business. I have always felt that part of my obligation for the price I pay for being in the business, being an entrepreneur, is trying to foster bringing people into the business, not to show them how to do it my way necessarily, but to give them the opportunity to do it well. And I've had people, a very good friend of mine that worked for me again in Manistee, Bob Holton, left me after a year or so up in the Upper Peninsula and went on to work for Post Corporation, managing stations, and then a few years back built his own station over in eastern Iowa, and just this last couple of months sold it and is retiring from the business. So I've had a number of friends that have worked for me that have gone on to very successful long-term careers. I feel good about that. I feel fortunate to have been able to give them the opportunity to be successful in the business. I hope I've contributed to that.
What is next for David Kelly, looking to the future?
I don't know. At some point in time, I will wind up selling my interest in Wayne, simply because I'm an old guy and I probably need to hang it up at some point. But that's not going to happen today. I still have an opportunity to provide a positive influence for the community. I've had the honor of serving for a number of years with the Nebraska Broadcasters Association, so I've had hopefully some input steering the industry. I think we have a lot of challenges ahead of us, and at the same time, I think we're up to those challenges because we are an industry that is durable, that has a tenacity and a texture to it that's tougher than a lot of other media businesses.
Our thanks to David Kelly for his contribution and his history in Nebraska broadcasting. We want to thank Jeff Sabin of WOWT, Channel 6 here in Omaha, for their help and their support in putting this series of recordings together. Also Jim Timm, Executive Director of the Nebraska Broadcasters Association, Chairman Emeritus Marty Riemenschneider. For the Nebraska Broadcasters Association History Project, I'm Neil Nelkin.